Good afternoon. So I'm here today with Dr. da Rocha and Miss Manton, and we're discussing negotiations and the idea of the politic in environments which are apparently not political. Pascal, maybe if we could start first. How do you deal with the concept of the villain in the room, the identifiable bad guy, particularly in a context where you're trying to reach some sort of conclusion or consensus?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria, for a question. Dealing with the villain in the room is one of these ethical dilemmas that you face as a mediator or a negotiator in any case, because depending on your mandate and your agency, you might have certain limitations and certain constraints. You might be a private person called upon to deal with the villain, who might that be, and you might have a better access point. If you come maybe from a state or a mandated organization where the rule is we do not negotiate with villains, then you're gonna have an issue, right? And here, your question is, there are three questions for this. First of all, from which perspective do we define the villain, and what does it mean to be the villain? Against what norms has this villain particularly behaved bad against? The second is, are we negotiating with the villain to save lives? A very essentialist approach, or are we going along the lines as the Harvard negotiators say, where we try to find an entry point into the negotiations? Typically, whatever you do, you got to realize that you have to have a certain amount of deniability. You have to ensure that somebody who claims to be credible but still acts against certain norms and values cannot be recognized as such. However, you might find that it's difficult to access the person because of either geographic constraints, ethical constraints, and other dilemmas. In theory, it's a difficult thing. In practice, you got to do it because there are sometimes the imperative of saving lives or the imperative of finding a fast, short-term solution to an immediate problem dictates how you're going to function. So in that sense, you have a range of models and tools that you have to know. From using insider mediators who have a closer proximity, which allows you to have plausible deniability. And you got to be able to practice tough bargaining because you have a very powerful person, either perceived or actual, in front of you. And you got to be able to ensure that these short-term provisions safeguard the space for further negotiations to come. In real life, those short-term provisions always fail. However, what you have achieved is you have opened up this space for further negotiations to take place and to happen. So you always have to take that strategic look into focus in order to make sure that whatever ethical dilemmata you might experience in the moment, you focus on the larger goal of widening the negotiation space, of finding entry points. And of connecting the dots afterwards. So it raises many questions, but in practice, if you have to have an entry point, you got to deal with whoever sits at the table in the first place.
Understanding, I suppose, most villains come with a significant constituency. So does the issue of recognition then become highly divisive? Or how do you get around that, particularly if you're dealing with an entity which has universal opprobrium, but nonetheless still has a constituency?
That's correct. You might find ways to persuade and influence. So use different tools of leverage rather than, let's say, the forceful or the overt pressure that you put onto a person like that. Here you might approach it from a perspective of not so much giving incentives, but to try to find a way to, and there are many cases around that you can study, to find a way to communicate a certain need to move on to the next stage. And again, the problem is here, what type of villain do we have? We have examples negotiating with Hamas, for example, who had an ideology, but you also had enough moderates in that camp who were able then to link to a more radicalized constituency. But the moderates, who were the negotiators, were able to display and give that message across. So again, it hinges upon the nature of the parties in the room. So not every villain is your villain. It depends largely on, do I have to do with a moderate? Can I actually offer something? Or do you have to do with the radical, where you know that the offering will not go too far, and that you have to realize as a mediator quite quickly and bow out of the negotiation, otherwise you have a mission creep over time that is not good for your reputation.
Fascinating. Keeping with that theme of the sort of political into these spaces, Ida, I wanted to ask you, based on your experience, what are the dangers with inherent short fixes?
Yeah, well, there are and few that I would like to mention. First of all, there's no overarching goddess of peace building that monitors everything and can tell us what is the temporal element of a certain conflict, right? You need somebody, and that would be our intellectual community, I guess, the system that we have been creating, the multilateral institutions that should have the institutional memory to remember that, if we have short fixes, they usually come back and they hurt us even more because we haven't dealt with certain devious behavior, with certain violations of a system that was created. It's very different when the system changes, but what we are looking at, particularly in this phase when we have the war in Ukraine, is conflicts that have emerged in the post-Second World War period and reoccurring with different manifestations in different parts of the world. If you're looking at conflicts that happened before that, it's a very different ballgame because simply the rules were different. The expectations have changed since the creation of the UN Charter, since the creation of the OSCE body of agreements and commitments that we have agreed this is our worldview. And within that worldview, it's very difficult when we have short fixes. Usually, they happen in some isolated regions or with isolated parties, and they are not taking into consideration the whole system. But sometimes in order to find common ground or common language, especially where you have had atrocities or war crimes, or, we're trying to fix the problem by offering something that either bans or even violates international standards and principles. And that is problematic because then they become precedents that are being used by people who are waiting for that aha moment, right? And then they become a much bigger problem. So we have seen that in the Balkans very often. For instance, many of the agreements that are celebrated as victory are actually violation of the standards that we have agreed before. We have agreed that we will not be easily dismissing certain war crimes or certain violations that happen during. We have a whole body of laws of war. And yet again, in the Ohrid Framework Agreement, for instance, we're talking about amnesty, which is problematic because then we start talking about amnesty in other conflicts. And we need the scientists, the experts to say, where is this coming from? Since when did we start doing that? And if we're doing that in, what is now North Macedonia, why don't we do that in Ukraine? And why don't we then do that in the Basque Country? How do we reintegrate members of, and those are different, right? Those are different cases, and everybody says very often, at least in the research that we're doing, you cannot apply one model for every society, but at least we need to know what is the base, what is the basic minimum of principles, normative framework that we have to subscribe to, and then be reminded that there is a reason why we have that, because those are our safety nets. That's our guarantees. And maybe often international law is aspirational. Maybe we cannot achieve everything, but short fixes mean that we have given up. And I'm not very comfortable with that idea of giving up on justice and peace when it comes to our future.
In your experience, what has been, if you can identify one, the single most detrimental short fix you've experienced?
Well, what I have experienced is I would choose one, I guess, and that would be the Prespa Agreement, which is the agreement between now North Macedonia and Greece. At the time, it was Republic of Macedonia that had to change the name, and that happened with the agreement. It was 28 years of underlying conflict. It was not violent, but it was deep. And it is not a conflict that was just in those 28 years. It was a diplomatic problem for those years. But the conflict is much longer. The conflict stems from, as I said, previous system, previous structures, previous ways of doing things. In the 19th century, most of the Balkan countries were used to moving population because they were not fitting in their image of the nation or the group. And you had exchange of population between Greece and Turkey. I remember in 1989, I was in Bulgaria when a lot of the Turks that are called Muslim there were kicked out on the other side of the border because they wanted to be considered Turk. So all of these minority issues in the Balkans have been very problematic because all of the countries somehow want to live with the imperialist biggest idea of what they once upon a time were. So the Prespa agreement, I really believe could have been done much better if it provided for expertise, professional and efficient dialogue, and the short fix by the people who were at the moment on the ground was, in my opinion, uninformed, very limiting, and I think opened up Pandora box for other situations in the Balkans that will follow the same pattern. And I hope that the European Union and all of the other multilateral institutions will figure out a way how to be smarter before we get to the end line of signing an agreement which might be more detrimental, maybe not for that particular conflict, but for the regional conflict, especially if the EU enlargement is being questioned and is putting some candidate countries on hold.
Ida, Pascal, that was very illuminating. Thank you very much for your time.